My name is Michael Morand. I have the good fortune of being Director of Community Engagement at the Beinecke Library. Welcome to the fourth Mondays at Beinecke Gallery Talk online of this fall semester. Today and every day, we at Yale University acknowledge that Indigenous peoples and nations, including the Mohegan, Mashantucket Pequot, Eastern Pequot, Schaghticoke, Golden Hill Paugussett, Niantic, Quinnipiac, and other Algonquin-speaking peoples have stewarded through generations the lands and waterways of what we know is the state of Connecticut. Today and every day, let us honor and respect the enduring relationship that exists between these peoples and nations in this land. And today and every day, let us hear and heed the voices and stories of generations past and present who have fought against racism, white supremacy, state violence, and systems of oppression, and who have fought for liberation, joy, and freedom. As you know, Beinecke Library, like the university overall, encourages engagement of the past in the present for the future. This engagement of the past in the present for the future is a mission we share with one of our nearest neighbors in New Haven, the Grove Street Cemetery, now marking its 225th anniversary, or more formally, its quasquibicentennial. Grove Street Cemetery is the nation's first publicly chartered cemetery and the first to be organized as the city of the dead, with streets and with family plots. A National Historic Landmark, it is an archive of our community, a veritable encyclopedia of New Haven. Noah Webster, whose birthday was yesterday, is buried there, as is Eli Whitney, Roger Sherman, and many others whose names are well known and whose biographies are published. We gather today, though, not to praise those famous men. Rather, we will consider the story of two greats, Bias and Margaret Stanley, who merit praise and whose stories should be more widely known. I will open our presentation this afternoon with some background on the cemetery, its origins, and its development through the 19th century. The second key part of our presentation, the most important part, will focus on the Stanleys and will be led by my colleague Tarel Dennie, a dynamic and brilliant student in Yale College, who is a valued part of the Beinecke community engagement team, a student intern this summer and into this fall. So to begin with a little bit about Grove Street Cemetery. As I mentioned, it is a National Historic Landmark and the first publicly chartered cemetery in the nation. New Haven itself was first settled by European colonial settlers, a group from England, in 1638. All of the early burials happened in a more haphazard way than we're familiar with organized cemeteries now in our day. And so most of the early burials happened in the churchyard, behind the center church. We're looking here at the Wadsworth map of 1748, and you can see in a later engraving based on that 1748 map, the graves here behind the center church, the founding church of New Haven on the green, what we know as the center church on the green. A little bit later, looking at these maps from the collections, is an Ezra Stiles map of 1775. By this time, there were three churches on the green, which we're familiar with in contemporary New Haven, and the burials were still on the green, on the upper green, behind the center church, this time a little bit more organized. You see that they're organized octagonally with an octagonal fence around them. In the 1700s, New Haven began to grow. In the early 18th century, it began to industrialize and there was more immigration, and it would grow even more. In 1794, as these public health records show, these public health records, which are in the Beinecke, there was a severe epidemic of yellow fever. You can see if you look closely that in the month of September 1794, 26 people died of yellow fever. New Haven was substantially smaller than it is now, and this would be the equivalent of 1,000 people dying probably in New Haven in a year from yellow fever, based on these statistics from 1794. So there was an epidemic of yellow fever. The green was unkempt with these burials. There was excess deaths. There was a desire to have more sanitary conditions. And a group led by the great leader of New Haven, James Hillhouse, decided to organize a new burial ground on the then outskirts of town. This is a drawing of Joseph Meigs's plan. This map comes from our colleagues at the New Haven Museum, and it is at the present site of Grove Street Cemetery, though if you know New Haven, you will note that this is much smaller than the current cemetery. It would grow over time. You see that Meigs, the plan, lays out the cemetery in 1797 in 4 main tiers, one of which was for Yale. The other 3 were for the then religious societies in town, 2 congregational and the Episcopal Society. There were also some areas laid out for quote unquote strangers, people who were not from New Haven, but who died while they were here. There was not refrigeration, so at that time you would be buried where you died, and an area that is marked here at the time, using the language of the time, for Negroes, for people of color, as would in years subsequent be called. The first burial happened on November 9th, 1797, of Martha Townsend. And you see this, that she died on Tuesday, the 7th instance, departed this life. Ms. Martha Townsend, wife of Mr. John Townsend. Her gravestone is on the left. The photograph here is by our dear colleague Sandra Markham, who is a great centurion of New Haven history, including of Grove Street Cemetery history. In 1824, you see this map also in the collections, and what we know as Grove Street Cemetery is called the New Burying Ground. This is that same map, just a different orientation. And if you look closely, you can see that the old burying ground is still there. So burials had ended on the cemetery, but the stones were still there. They would all eventually be removed to the Grove Street Cemetery. Some of them were intermingled with families who bought family plots in the new cemetery. The Yale stones were in Yale plots, and the others were laid around the back wall in alphabetical order, as they are now for those familiar with the cemetery. By 1830, the cemetery was the size that it is now, and was at this point marked on a map in the collections as just the burying ground. It's no longer the new burying ground. Further plans were developed at this time as the cemetery grew, and at this point, the entrance was moved from where it had been when it was a smaller cemetery, and more on this in a moment. And in 1845, the fence and wall that we know now was completed, and the stone was laid for the iconic entry gate designed by New Haven's leading architect, Henry Austin. And this is a drawing from Henry Austin papers here in Yale Library Special Collections. 1852, you see it denominated as the City Burial Ground. 1868, New Haven Cemetery. Again, the same size as we know it today. This bird's eye view gives you a sense of the industrializing and developing city of New Haven, and it was just marked as the cemetery. And by 1893, the cemetery, which was more than a century old, had been marked earlier on earlier maps as the new burying ground, is by this point the old cemetery. And there were, of course, multiple cemeteries by this point throughout New Haven, as there remains today. Many are familiar with the line carved on Austin's gate, which comes from 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 52. The trumpet shall sound, the verse begins, and then you see the words carved here, the dead shall be raised. So that's a famous line about the cemetery, but I want to encourage us to think of a different line in scriptures. One that comes from originally Psalm 118 and is picked up in the Gospels, both of Mark and of Matthew. And it is a line that is known to many. The stone which the builder rejected has become the chief cornerstone. And in many ways, that's what we're talking about today, and that T.D. Dennie will talk about stones which the builders, as it were, that the majority culture rejected, but which can be for us in our time as we recover, rediscover, and do better history, cornerstones. As I mentioned, and then the image on the left is the Meigs plan. The entry to the cemetery was between the second tier and the third tier, between the Episcopal Society and Yale College. The cemetery grew, added acreage, and was eventually fenced and walled in with that iconic Henry Austin gate. And at that point, the main entrance where you would enter was shifted to between the fourth and fifth tiers of the further developed cemetery. These are images yesterday of the area that would be what was the original entrance between the Episcopal Society and Yale lots. And on the right is where you enter now, facing the what's now an office, had been a chapel, and to the left, what was the fifth tier that includes the burial grounds of early Black people in New Haven. You will recall it was the area that had been denominated, for using the language of the time, Negro, or later in the map that we saw from 1837, for people of color. The area that was the original entry point is an area that on its right has the gravestone of Ralph Isaacs Ingersoll, Congressman of New Haven, and one of the leaders against the plan for a Black college in New Haven. The area where you enter now, you see a gravestone that honors some of the Mende people of the Amistad uprising. You see the Creed family, members of the Duplex family. W.B. Du Bois's grandparents are actually buried in this area. They were New Haveners. You see the grave of William Grimes and his wife, Clarissa Caesar Grimes, her family. You see the grave of the Austin family, and you see the graves of the Stanley family. We will turn to them now, and I hope that you will listen, learn, and be inspired, as I have been, by the research that T.D. Dennie has done and that others before him have done. And that will also inspire some who are watching now to add to this research, to use the knowledge that we gather here for, as the stone which the builder rejected has become the chief cornerstone. The kind of history you're going to hear now can be a great building block for a better understanding of what New Haven was and what New Haven can be. TD.
Alrighty, hello again. My name is Tarel Dennie, and I am a junior in Yale College. And this summer, I was blessed with the opportunity to work with Michael in the community engagement at the Beinecke. And a big part of my work this summer was about researching the Bias and Margaret Stanley. And in working very closely with the Grove Street Cemetery right across the street from the Beinecke, it really illuminated a couple of really important points about Black history in the 19th century, and kind of how religion played a really important role into the development of Black liberation in New Haven, which is an extremely rich story. And when walking through the cemetery and looking at the gravestones of Bias and Margaret Stanley and all the people inside the Grove Street Cemetery, I was able to realize how alive the place is, how most of the time people feel quite disconnected from the bodies and the lives of the people who are buried in cemeteries they meet. Obviously with the exception of loved ones, but this mindset is adopted simply because there is this misconception, a very strong misconception, that those buried in these cemeteries do not directly affect their current lives. And so if you were to go and visit a random town, of course, those bodies might not necessarily be extremely poignant to your own life, but I think that whether you live in New Haven or not, the people who are buried in Grove Street Cemetery, some really powerful, influential, and prominent leaders who not only help build up New Haven and Yale, but also help establish our country in the way that we live in it today, of course, for better and for worse. And so with the Beinecke having in mind the motto, engaging with the past in the present for the future, I've come to realize that this is in fact implicitly the same way when it comes to how cemeteries function. Of course, engaging with the past, once these people have passed on, people in the present are able to come to the cemeteries, namely the Grove Street Cemetery, and really learn about their stories, their mishaps, their successes, and begin to shape the future in a better way from the way that the people buried in the cemetery are able to live. And so cemeteries serve as incredible storytellers for the lives of those who lay in them, and could have implicitly speaking to those who are living and be able to simply just walk and see the gravestones. And so as in this first slide that we see is in fact the gravestone of Bias and Margaret Stanley. They actually share one big stone, which is the one you see on the left, and they're sort of planted adjacent to each other on 90-degree angles around. And on this picture on the right, we can see Bias Stanley's epitaph transcription. And he actually had a couple of different epitaph transcription drafts that were made for him. And this one that we can see is actually really important because it was to tell a bit of important biographical information about him as well. So the first line below where it says Bias Stanley, we see born in Chester, Pennsylvania and died in New Haven, Connecticut. And it says August 22nd, 1854, aged 85. And so that date, August 22nd, 1854, is actually his death date, but it's quite notable that there's a birth date missing, and that is, I've learned, has come to see because simply those Black people at the time were not granted the ability to see and to know historically and pass down when their birth dates were. And I think that this little moment is able to highlight the rest of the context of Bias Stanley's life, how he as a Black man was able to rise to such prominence and power and influence in the New Haven community, as well as the New Haven Christian community, to fight for the liberation of Black people. And so with this being the final edition of his epitaph, we're able to see that it mentions that Bias Stanley was a prominent Black man who served as the deacon and treasurer to the Temple Street Church, which is now affectionately known as the Dixwell Avenue Congregational Church, which is right up on Dixwell Avenue. And as you can see from the rest of the epitaph in his death in 1884, he was able to dedicate his entire estate, over $10,000, to the church, which of course $10,000 is a lot of money even now, but of course back in 1854, this is a really, really big deal because it's now the equivalent of over $350,000. And he was able to donate this money to the education of the youth of the church, the Temple Street Church, as well as the prosperity of the church as a whole, which directly is benefiting Black people in New Haven, because the Dixwell Avenue Congregational Church, formerly known as Temple Street Church, was a Black church. And this is really important in the way that his Christianity is engaged with throughout his whole life. And as we can see, sadly, his epitaph is now heavily weathered to the point of functionally illegibility unless you were able to have the drafts on hand. It's very clear that he is able to be a large part of the church and New Haven history in general. And so if we change to the next slide, we'll be able to see an original draft. Yes, and so with that being said, we're also adjacent to Bias Stanley's epitaph draft. We're able to see Margaret, his wife. And hers actually, though we don't have a picture here, is still partially legible, which is really cool to see the difference between the two, because she, of course, died 7 years after him. But hers reads, wife of Deacon Bias Stanley, died in New Haven, Connecticut, November 12th, 1861, aged 81. And hers also is pretty important when it comes to her own relationship with the church and how she worked for the betterment of the people in the church, as well as Black people in a whole. Reading, thoughtful for her people, she generously completed her husband's charities and bestowed her savings on her church and on poor widows of her color. And below with a quote saying, daughters of my dispersed shall bring mine offering. And so it also, once again, is able to point out that despite the fact that Bias was this amazing figure in the church, deacon, treasurer, Margaret also had her spheres of influence beyond just being Bias's wife. And that's often overshadowed for women, especially Black women. And as we go further into history, that becomes more and more apparent as their stories are fewer and fewer are told. But Margaret was very active in the female life and improving the station of the women in the church as well as in New Haven. And so by completing her husband's charities, once Bias died 7 years before her, she was able to make sure that their donation as a couple, as a family, was able to be carried out to their wishes, as well as some of that actually being reserved for the betterment of the women, which might not have been very apparent without her continuing to live on and have this influence, which is amazing. And so with that being said, we're able to see the couple's influence is very much alive, despite the fact that they have been dead for over 100 years now. With that being said, we're able to see that this donation, an equivalent of $350,000 today, it could be a very large part of the continuous flourishing of the Temple Street Church, which is now the Dixwell Avenue Congregational Church. And if we were to go to the next slide, we'd be able to see this note that's written, this wealthy couple. And that is really important because it kind of groups them, has their time separately as well as a whole. This was a draft as well that would be going on their epitaph headstone. And it basically just outlines in the summation of what I just said, by using their frugality, by collecting this money with the intention, of course, to donate it later on to the church of over $10,000, they were able to directly influence and better the youth of the church and the women and all the other people. And so in addition to their activity in the church, which is obviously their largest sphere of influence, what they're probably most known for in life, they were extremely involved in the New Haven locality. We were able to see that they probably lived at 52 College Street, which we believe may now be the house adjacent to what is Pacifica Restaurant on College Street. We're on that strip of restaurants where those are all. So that is a very accessible and well-known place. And to think over 150 years ago, that this place, this station, we're able to identify as a place where Bias and Margaret may have lived. And beyond just that, their physical dwelling, we know that the couple donated to and helped solicit donations for the endeavor of establishing the College for Colored Youth, which we now know would have been the first HBCU, or historically Black college or university in America. But this endeavor was voted down by the New Haven congressional body at the time. So this never actually came to fruition. But this really is apparent that they are working toward the betterment of Black people in New Haven beyond just through their religious avenues, but through their very public and very powerful station outside of the church. And so if we were to go to the next slide again, yes, sorry, it's very small, but this is actually an agreement among Bias Stanley and a couple of other really prominent Black leaders in New Haven at the time. And so the Stanleys did work with many prominent leaders in New Haven and across Connecticut for the improvement of Black people in their society. And a big part of this was them building bonds and rapport through their Christianity. So many of the Black people that they worked with are very iconic, noble figures in New Haven, such as Prince Duplex and Scipio Augustus, who was actually an original member of the founding of the Temple Street Church, of course, now Dixwell Avenue Congregational Church, and Amos Beeman, who was also a social activist and once pastor of Temple Street Church. But among working with these important Black people who also have their own important and very powerful stories, they actually did work with a couple of white abolitionists in New Haven that helped support the Stanleys in their liberation endeavors. Most principally, I mentioned Simeon Jocelyn, whose name you can see right below Bias's, who was a Yale Divinity School graduate who went on to be actually a white minister of the Temple Street Church at a time, which of course is an interesting idea because it is a Black church. So this person, Simeon Jocelyn, was actually an important part of the piece outside of their immediate Black community. And this agreement specifically is really illuminating because it shows that Jocelyn became a member of the church, signed off on by all these Black prominent leaders that I mentioned, and even more. And so you can really see the important public puzzle piece that they played in the betterment of the Black community, and how Bias Stanley worked with all different types of people, Bias and Margaret together, to fight for this endeavor to improve Black station. And so once again, with Bias and his wife Margaret amassing such great wealth and influence in New Haven, this was of course not an easy feat. They also had to endure the typical treatment of Black people at the time, such as restrictions on their freedom via imposed laws and rules that were only levied on Black people. And one of these issues was that of the Gradual Emancipation Act, which we can see. We were to go to the next one. Yes. And this is actually a letter that was co-opted between Bias Stanley and William Lanson, another Black man in New Haven, that was submitted in 1784. The Gradual Emancipation Act was passed in 1784, which actually ended hereditary slavery by requiring freedom for slaves for those once they reached the age of 25, if they were born in slavery after March 1st. Of course, a lot of different caveats, though once these people who qualified for this Gradual Emancipation Act were released from slavery, it still didn't grant them the right to vote, though eventually they could, of course, purchase property and pursue an education. Their inability to vote was really an important aspect to their full citizenship, their ability to affect change and fight for their liberation from a congressional administrative point of view, rather than just their work in their communities, to begin to legitimize and sort of solidify their freedom in America. So after the ratification of the state constitution in 1818, Connecticut actually restricted voting to only white men, of course. And so with William Lanson and Bias Stanley working together to spearhead an initiative to get Black people that they would stop paying taxes until they had the right to vote. So of course, this is another idea of this no taxation without representation that we've seen before this time. And so once 1870 came, the 15th Amendment was passed, and voting rights were officially not able to be denied based on one's race or previous certitude. So this is another example that Bias Stanley not only worked within New Haven, again, with religious means, he was able to work to affect change outside of just his immediate community and at really large scale level that made the Connecticut Assembly really take notice and take heed of what is going on in New Haven and the Black coalition to fight for the liberation and fight for their equality. And so that's one different sphere where we have Bias Stanley working around these issues and these rules that restricted Black people's freedom. But another one of these was the requirement of a passport of sorts to travel about. If we were to go to the next slide, we'll be able to see a Bias Stanley's print. There you go, his pass from 1796. He actually had to carry around with himself to certify that he was a free man. And if you can see, this was signed off by John Jennings, who was a white man. So this is the idea that Black people kind of only were able to do the things that they did upon the permission, upon the certification by white people at the time. And so part of this was, in order to have this permission to travel with a white companion, it states that he had to work with a certain type of propriety. Look in the last word of that first paragraph, you see this word propriety. And when I first came across this when going through our Beinecke Stanley papers in the Beinecke, that word really stuck with me because it actually appears in a lot of different documents when speaking about or writing about Bias Stanley. In fact, he behaves with propriety. And of course, this idea of propriety was never clearly defined at all and completely subjective to the opinion of the white person that was giving this qualification to him, giving this description of his behavior around them, whether or not it was proprietous or not. And so that is a really big moniker for sort of how Black people had to behave and how to work around kind of this societal pressures that Bias Stanley very masterfully was able to do to get to the station and the influence and the power and the recognition that he ended up getting to. And so Black people at the time, despite their positions or their fortunes, often had to have the consent and approval from the wealthy white landowners of the city to do pretty much anything. This pass is a great example to travel alone, but there also is the idea to perform business, which establishes the idea of a bit of a sponsorship. And so if we were to go to the next slide, a major part of that is fitting into once again, this general propriety. And here is actually a certificate of character for Bias Stanley that was actually signed by 14 wealthy white landowners in New Haven. And you can see it's a very long list. For some of them were able to simply sign off of what someone said before or actually write very explicitly about their experiences with Bias Stanley. And as I mentioned before, the word propriety is mentioned. Every single one of those little letters, those little blurbs about their experience with Bias Stanley. So this is clearly a really important part of what makes a Black person acceptable to do pretty much anything or be in the company with or do business with, among others people. And so, first of all, it is ridiculous that this is even needed, right? Like it's functionally a permission slip, like children's need to go on field trips or something, rather for a fully grown adult to engage with free business in his time to not only better himself, but also his community. But also, it made me ponder, if he had not fit into this idea of propriety, it's pretty safe to say that he probably would not have done all the good for the Black New Haven community that he was actually able to do. And so me as a Black person nowadays, like the idea of how I'm able to work and go to school and pretty freely engage in the endeavors that I want to, and not have to have a certificate of character or not be necessarily deemed as having behavior worthy of propriety. That has a really personal connection I was able to draw between myself and how far Black liberation has come, in part due to the work of Bias Stanley and Margaret Stanley. So because he was able to earn the trust and the approval of the wealthy white landowners of New Haven, he was able to earn enough money and influence to equip to do business with really prominent white people, most notably Timothy Dwight, which was actually the 8th president of Yale. If we were to go to the next slide, we will see the contract between Timothy Dwight and Bias Stanley, in which Bias was actually given partial dominion over a plot of agricultural land on the Hartford Turnpike for a season. And Bias Stanley and Timothy Dwight were actually split the yields from the land. And so that's pretty amazing that Bias was able to get to this professional and societal place where he was able to do very direct business negotiations with a man like Timothy Dwight, very wealthy, very powerful in New Haven. And many Black people, unfortunately, weren't given the opportunity to do such a thing. And so, of course, with his public stature, he really made it an important mission of his to share this wealth, as very clearly seen in the beginning with this donation of over $10,000. And so with him serving as a deacon of the Temple Street Church for colored people, it is very clear that religion, specifically Christianity, was extremely important to him. So if we go to the next slide, we will see that he established the African United Ecclesiastical Society, which was an organization founded with the purpose of improving the morals and promoting piety and increasing religious knowledge among Black people in New Haven. So here we see actually is the Constitution articles of the African United Ecclesiastical Society of New Haven, in which this verbiage is directly used. And of course, as we know from or United States history that we've all taken, one really interesting fact about this document is that its structure is so directly mirroring the Constitution of the United States, which is written, of course, 37 years before in 1787. So both have preambles, both have enumerated articles, etc. So it's interesting to consider the impact of the nation's foundational documents with foundational documents that are created afterward, even by those who feel like these original ones, the Constitution, Declaration of Independence, etc., do not actually protect them. So it's an idea where it's this like perversive and subversive idea of creating a document that is so directly structured from a different document that for these people very directly doesn't do what it sets out to do. It's almost as if they are like co-opting this structure and co-opting this way of infrastructure that actually works, that actually does what it says it's meant to do to protect the people that it is governing, that people who work under and that it governs. And so, of course, many people consider these documents to be dead, but just like a cemetery, these documents and certainly their impacts are very much alive as their influences still radiate through our world today, and very poignantly, of course, in New Haven. So from the Constitution to the Articles of the African United Ecclesiastical Society to Bias Stanley, with them, our world would not be the way that it is now, of course, for better or for worse. And places like the Grove Street Cemetery teaches how important it is to really engage with the past and how it still affects our present in order to create a better future. So in conclusion of sorts, Bias Stanley and all the people in Grove Street Cemetery serve very similar purposes to as the Beinecke does, allowing us to very directly engage with the past, literally stand above their bodies in our current present, as we can leave the cemetery and leave these places and leave the Beinecke Library to take these lessons that we learn and these stories to create a better future. Thank you very much.
Thank you, TD, and thank you to the great audience that we have. We do have some time for Q&A. As we turn to that, I'd note I put in the chat links to the documents that TD has been showing. We have at Beinecke Library a collection of Connecticut legal documents. It's what might be called an artificial collection in library land. So it's a number of different legal documents, and the different folders don't necessarily relate to each other, but there's a fantastic folder of the documents related to Bias and Margaret Stanley, many of which TD has highlighted, and all of which you can see in the web article that I sent you in the chat, and that is as well as the direct link to those documents. The story that's referenced is from an event we did with the Dixwell Avenue Congregational United Church of Christ in honor of their bicentennial, which was a bicentennial +2 because the actual bicentennial was delayed due to COVID. But we did an event in the cemetery at the graves of Bias and Margaret Stanley, the Creeds, Duplexes, Grimes, and others, and then came to Beinecke to look at the documents. And again, you can see links to many of the people and stories and be able to look more. I wanted to TD just to ask you, we're in a virtual environment here in 2 dimensions, but you've encountered the documents in 3 dimensions. You've done transcriptions and worked through the physical documents. The Stanleys in much of early Black New Haven and much of early Black America, there aren't pictures of them. There aren't other physical documents. So the tombstone, many early Americans, including especially Black Americans, might not have tombstones. So these papers, including the past that he carried as a newly freed person, he had been born enslaved in Pennsylvania, and the other documents, his signature, are literally the 3-dimensional objects that remain of him. And I just wonder if you could just describe sort of being with the documents and what it means, and maybe by way of encouraging others who've not done archival work to do it. Just describe some of what it's like to be with and read and transcribe and understand the physical documents of 200+ years ago.
Absolutely. So I actually am from Georgia. And so in Georgia, I unfortunately did not have a really wide, like very deep or wide ranging experience with Black history in the United States. Of course, we had our Martin Luther King information, but beyond those pretty surface level, large figures, I didn't really get to see deeper, lower level, more specific and local influences. So reading about Bias Stanley was actually quite important in my realization that, of course, there is so much more history, specifically Black history, when it comes to leaders and prominent figures that worked toward the liberation of Black people in America. And so that was pretty important when it comes to being a Black person who grew up in predominantly white spaces and kind of still exists in an institution that has a predominantly white past, of course. And so that kind of felt very personal. So that gave myself a bit of a legitimacy when it comes to operating in the spaces that I do, as well as like my own efficacy. So that's kind of a personal note of how it impacted me. When it comes from an academic standpoint and a like professional one, it is illuminating to how important these stories are to then how they need to be told in all different types of settings, whether that be in the classroom, whether that be casually over meals, whether that be in performance. These stories are extremely powerful. And the fact that they are so few and far between told is an issue. With there being no pictures of these people, which are major ways that people in the future are able to look at figures from the past and recognize who they are. Bias Stanley sort of exists in this very liminal space of a signature or a tombstone that is, or an epitaph that is heavily weathered, right? And so as when it comes to advise people to come into the library and kind of read these things themselves, I have learned in the past summer more about Black history in New Haven and the United States, and how strong of and thorough of a history that there is, and kind of how my place fits into that both as a Black person in general, as well as in this present, that for the same for Black people or any other type of person looking for their own type of history or the history of others, this is the space to do it, because I think it really ignited a fire under me to learn more and actively work in that tradition to better all people, not just Black people, and the work that I can produce.
Thank you. We have a question from the audience. Are there existing archives of the Temple Street Church? And the answer, now known as the Dixwell Avenue Congregational United Church of Christ. The church maintains archives. The church has a historian, Charles Warner Jr., and Mr. Warner gave a Mondays at Beinecke talk about the Amos Beeman scrapbooks, which the church put at Beinecke Library, and which are fully digitized. And you can find that talk in the Beinecke Library YouTube. But the Beeman scrapbooks are a great source of 19th century Black New Haven and beyond history. Beeman was a local and state and national figure. And they were one of the resources that you looked at, TD. So I wonder if you could just talk a little bit more about those scrapbooks. And it's an archive that people can access online, but you did a great job reading through those.
Yes, and so in addition to my research this summer with the Stanleys, I was able to read through Amos Beeman scrapbooks, which are basically collections of work that he did, as well as work that was happening around New Haven and events that were happening around New Haven that he felt notable when it comes to pertaining to Black people. And so with him being a former pastor of the Temple Street Church, of course now Dixwell Avenue Church, a lot of these records were, of course, oriented toward the betterment of the church. And so in this scrapbooks, I was able to see that there were many different events that he attended, both in New Haven as well as in other cities around the Northeast. Most principally, I saw a lot of in Philadelphia that were talking about how Black people were coming together to work toward the betterment of Black people in their respective cities, specifically through a religious lens. And so a part of one of the most poignant things that I learned from reading those scrapbooks was how religion that they used as a unifying force that serves as an undercurrent through every single thing that every single endeavor that they pursued, whether that be Black liberation, the formation of Black community, formation of Black education, political power, etc. And so with kind of tying those two questions together, both the Amos Green Scrapbooks one, as well as records for what is now Dixwell Avenue Congregational Church, a lot of those is really underscoring how important religion was for the Black community across America. And of course, we know that. And slavery, religion was something that kept a lot of Black people through, a ties of connection among them. And this kind of exists beyond that, which is how important these Black churches were to everyone who was a part of them, really important safe havens to them. And the Amos Green Scrapbooks really highlight that it's not just in their own individual church homes, not just a Temple Street church, not just another church, but the greater Black church community all worked together across their different localities to further the betterment of each other and the whole nation. And so collaboration through religion was a big note that I saw in the scrapbooks that was really poignant to me.
Number of questions asked about the names, and I don't know that we know where the name Stanley comes from, the surname. Margaret Stanley and Bias Stanley are buried with her mother, Peggy Jones, who's there. So we know her, Mrs. Stanley's surname at birth probably was Jones. Bias, a number of people have commented in the sort of irony of a name like Bias, given racial discrimination. His name, which rarely was in one of the documents, it's spelled out, and he clearly went by Bias, but it is Tobias. So the origin of his name would be a biblical origin. Some would know the story of that Tobias is mentioned in Scripture. But a number of questions, and so if you want to reflect on the names, TD, great. But the question I pose to you is, what questions do you have? And if you weren't a full-time student working at Beinecke, doing visitor center tours, acting on the main stage, if you had all the time in the world and we're going to be looking further into this, what are the questions that you have to learn more about the Stanleys and their world?
Absolutely. Questions I have, in fact, I kind of created this in a very thematic sense of their locality and their religion and their money and their behavior, right? But I would be really interested to see where their life leads outside of religion and business, right? I'm an English major and I create a lot of writing and work, and I would love to see, know more about how art fits into their lives, because it of course fits into all of ours. Whether that even just be worship in their church, that is a huge part of the religious experience, and creating art and kind of having those two come together. And I think in a lot of Bias Stanley papers, it is centered around his work to better Black people, his work in the church, his work in New Haven. But I would love to kind of see the background of this work. What is the artistic, potentially undercurrent and catalyst for how this work is created? And of course, I'm able to recognize that it's not lost on me that is kind of a privilege, right? Being able to create art in a way that's external to your actual work or your station in society, right? And able to have the mental space to do that on the side. And it's quite possible, because of the state in which Black people were in, that might not exist in a very large way, that it might be able to exist in my life that is a moniker of how far we have come. But I would love to know kind of what is the artistic background of the two of them and how potentially that bleeds into their work and is shown.
Great. And a number of other people have questions, and we hope that these talks are generative. We do not expect in half an hour, and even over a series of Mondays to be able to provide all the answers. So we hope to spur curiosity, to give some insights and angles and some entry. One of our audience members noted that there's clearly lots of other stories in the cemetery, which there are. One audience member asked, is the cemetery still open for burials? And the answer very much is yes. I put in the chat a link to the website of the Grove Street Cemetery, and you can find more about cemetery history and burials, past and present. It is very much, and it's a open 365 days a year. Some people also asked about tours. You'll find on that website, there are tours on many Saturdays, and there are other tours, and if groups are interested in tours, there's information on how to connect with that. One of our audience members, who is a centurion of the Dixwell Church and of New Haven, noted that it would be great for students in the New Haven Public Schools to know the story of the Stanleys more and other people. And this summer, we had a group of U.S. Grant, the great middle school program, New Haven Public School middle school students who study at Yale came through, and you talked to them about the Stanleys. I wonder if you could just talk about that some and your experience, their reaction, and how you might see the cemetery, as it were, as an encyclopedia, as a resource for teaching.
Absolutely. Again, I opened this with the idea that the cemetery is very alive, and it is one of the best storytellers about history that really exists. And so being able to take that group into the cemetery, and tell them the stories of these people, they were all so immediately engaged and so immediately interested in what we were sharing. And I think, again, I was paying quite particular attention in looking at this, telling the story, and seeing like the reactions of the young Black kids in the room. Of course, everyone was given like this information enthusiastically, but I could see a couple of people really have light bulb moments for them, and maybe even like raise their shoulders a little bit and sit up a little taller, even in this moment where they're seeing really powerful, important people who look like them have important impacts and be able to be influential and remembered, right? That is an extremely empowering thing for a young Black person in America. Of course, I never got that when I was a little kid, but these stories being told not only to young Black kids, but also to everyone, every young child. The same thing kind of goes hand in hand, where hearing stories about people who all look different, come from different backgrounds, different religions, different cultures, is a really important one, because it not only highlights the diversity of America, because of course it is a very diverse nation, though it may not always appear as though what is focused on is rooted in diversity. But for each and every kid who is able to hear a story about someone who looks like them, or has the same religion as them, or is from the same place as them, or comes from the same means as them, it allows them to believe that they can do whatever that person did. It is immediately empowering for them to be able to say, you know what, I can affect change just like this person. I can be a great leader just like this person. It's not only reserved for one type of person. And so anyone who's saying that this should be adapted and told to grade school children, that is absolutely right. And that's the goal. And that's where we want to begin to move forward toward. And I think that came so poignant to me in being able to speak to the middle schoolers from US Grant and tell them about Bias and Margaret Stanley and other people who were buried in the Grove Street Cemetery, because I could see how they immediately saw that could be them. You know, they could be so influential in their communities as people were.
And in many ways, that is in keeping with the genesis of the cemetery. James Hillhouse, who I mentioned, great leader of New Haven, established the cemetery with his colleagues, both for practical reasons, to ensure that the graves would be well cared for over the generations, for reasons of public health and sanitation, as I mentioned. But he also did it because he wanted the cemetery to be a place that future generations would encounter the stories of the past. That it would be the kind of place where the work that you've done, the storytelling that you did with the middle school students, the tours that are led of the cemetery, and individuals who just go through to be inspired and to maybe see a name they know, maybe see a famous name, but also to see names they don't know and say, I want to know more. So what you were doing with the middle school students, what we're doing today, is in keeping with what Hillhouse wanted, that it would be a resource for future generations to understand where we all came from, where we are, and where we might go. As I noted, this is the quasquibicentennial year of the Grove Street Cemetery, the 225th anniversary. I've put in the chat a link to an event that's upcoming on November 6th about cemetery history generally, particularly English garden cemeteries that begin in the after Grove Street Cemetery. But the talk will touch on Grove Street Cemetery and others. And for those of you who are taphophiles, you will enjoy this. And those of you who don't think you're taphophiles, you actually are. Taphophilia is a word like bibliophilia, which means lover of books. Taph, root word meaning death or funerary, are those who are interested in cemeteries. And because you signed up for this talk today, you are by definition a taphophile. One final program note before a final question to TD. Next week's talk will actually touch on some of the people that TD mentioned, maybe not by name, but some of the list of the white people who were signatories for Bias Stanley's character, included people like David Daggett, the founder of the Yale Law School, who we also encountered in our conversations about the 1831 college. Next week's talk will be led by our colleagues Catherine James and Fred Shapiro of the Yale Law Library, and it will be coming from be talking about an exhibit that they have up now on the founders of the Yale Law School. And so I encourage everyone to come next Monday for Mondays at Beinecke. Before a final question to you, TD, note first that Stanleys did not have children per se. And that's partly they left all of their wealth, which they had acquired, as you mentioned, in the work that Bias Stanley did, properties they owned and rented. So they supported other children over time. And while they didn't have blood descendants, direct descendants and children, in many ways, they have many spiritual descendants. And I have no doubt that they are glad to know that you are one of them. And that you are embodying the spirit and are a descendant of the Stanleys and a direct descendant in many ways. Final question. You've worked in Beinecke, you've worked in the archives, you are a tour guide, one of the standout tour guides of campus. Yeah. We have good audiences. We had 300 people online today, and thank you to everyone who came. Amazing. Many people may not have been in the library, much less in the reading room to do research. So do your tour guide best to close us out, to encourage neophytes of why they should follow in your footsteps and come into Beinecke Library and Yale Library Special Collections, and not only come into the building, but register and do research. So give us a pitch to close us out.
Oh, he's putting me on the spot, but to close us off, yeah, I think that the stories that are present within this library are ones that are invaluable to human history. So, of course, with the original conceit of the library being to like document like academic history, right? We have begun to grow this collection to which it is now more of a almost a love letter of sorts to human society and human development. So beyond just what the name might insinuate to you of rare books and manuscripts, we have materials of all different types. We have journals, we have letters, we have administrative papers, we have constitutions to the African United States Ecclesiastical Society, we have audiovisual material, etc. So the breadth and depth of material that is in here on probably any given topic that you might be interested in, there is a wealth of knowledge that you're able to actually have in your hand. And I'm not sure if Michael mentioned this earlier, but anyone is able to sign up and check out material to read in our reading room. So of course we are a non-circulating library, but the fact that this is a public library, that anyone, whether or not you are affiliated with Yale in any official capacity, can come in and use these materials for your own research, your personal development, your curiosity, is really one of a kind. And with the breadth of information that we have is really important. So at a personal level, I was able to really find and identify with stories of people who came before me. And so again, I'm an English major. Stories are really important to me, as you can probably tell. The ability to identify and hold these stories in my hand and begin to cobble little bits of information together about the Stanleys, Black New Haven, and any of my interests that I was able to research this summer. It was so personally developing. As an author, as a writer, as a person, as a New Haven community member, that these stories go beyond just what is written on paper or what you just look at the painting that you see, but it is still active in your everyday life, that it is an invaluable experience to be able to look at documents and letters and paintings and journals of people who existed 10 years ago and also hundreds of years ago. It is actively engaging with what it all has happened in human history up until this point, and you can find really delicate and really personally poignant ways in which you fit into that story, and will continue to be a part of that story actively in the future. So it is so personally important that we all take the time to engage with human history and find ways to be a part of it.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for joining us. Have a blessed evening and see as many of you as possible next Monday.